Welcome to Hot Tees and the Center for T-Shirt Excellence, where we make your t-shirt dreams a reality. Normally, we would bring our custom apparel experience to you, but since we can't be on site today, we have created an online store that will be available for the next 5 days. Every shirt is made right here in our shop in Harrisburg, Oregon. Let me show you some of the options that we have. This tie-dye I'm wearing is one of my personal favorites, but wait, it's missing something. That's better. And if tie-dye isn't your style, we have a variety of other options. And we even have jackets and hats. Some say what we do is a little bit of magic, but to us, it is just part of a normal day. We hope you will shop with us online at hotteesapparel.com/Mount Hood Jazz.
What began in a small workshop in the Sellwood area of Portland over 75 years ago has now grown into the largest piano dealership in North America. For 4 generations, one Portland family has been honored to serve the piano needs of musicians, schools, institutions, artists, and music lovers throughout the Pacific Northwest and beyond. This is the evolving story of classic pianos, and the story of the Eunice family, a family steeped in the love of pianos. It all began when Maurice T. Schuster, a violinist with the Portland Symphony and piano technician, opened a small piano shop that specialized in tuning, servicing, and restoring vintage pianos. Within a short time, his reputation as a master piano technician was well established and the business grew steadily. The growth continued, culminating with bringing his grandson, Maurice Eunice, into the business in the 1970s, nurturing, coaching, and cultivating Maurice's love of pianos and piano restoration. After his grandfather's passing, Maurice continued in the piano business, eventually opening and growing a successful piano retail showroom in Portland, and then selling that business to a large national chain. In the early 90s, Maurice began serving as a piano and promotional consultant assisting piano dealers, and in early 2001 opened another small piano showroom in Portland with his son Brian under the name Classic Pianos. Soon Maurice was joined by his other sons, Aaron and Taylor. Since that short time, Classic Pianos has grown into the largest and most awarded piano dealership in the U.S., with 7 showrooms throughout North America, including Portland, Seattle, Denver, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Boston, Anchorage, and now serving all of the Hawaiian Islands. Even though the company has grown nationally, at its heart, it is still a family-owned and operated business with the belief that music can change lives for the better. Maurice has often said, "We deal with dreamers, professional pianists, teachers, beginners of all ages who want choices." Each pianist longs to find the perfect piano that suits their particular taste and preference. Ask what he means by choices, and Maurice explains it this way: "We continue to partner with the best manufacturers and never stop researching to ensure we offer value and quality. We carry pianos ranging from entry-level studio and professional uprights to heirloom models from Börsendorfer, Yamaha, Schimmel, and Estonia, as well as a comprehensive collection of nearly new, like new, and restored Steinways from every era."
To see how Classic Pianos can serve you and your piano needs, visit us at classicpianosportland.com.
Hey!
Hey!
Hi!
It's time to crack an egg.
Easy, any style egg works here.
Or smile.
Well done, this looks great.
Time to share a story.
I have a great way to start our discussion.
With old friends or new ones.
When you're a caregiver.
Time to breathe in.
Inhale up. Good job.
Then let it all out. It's never been easier to connect, learn, and have fun.
Cheers!
So let's do it together. Come find us at aarp.org/near-you.
Hello, my name is Roland Andrews, Vice President of AARP. And on behalf of AARP and our AARP Oregon team, welcome to the 2021 Mount Hood Jazz Festival. As you know, jazz is a uniquely American art form that is deeply rooted in the African American Black tradition, culture, and heritage. But more importantly than any of that, jazz is just food for the soul. It provides a measure of peace, it can provide a measure of comfort, and it can provide overall healing in a time like this when we need it most. So what I want you to do now is just sit back. I want you to relax and just take in those smooth, comfortable, cool, healing sounds of American jazz. So on behalf of the organizers of the Mount Hood Jazz Festival and your good friends and wise defenders at AARP, welcome to the 2021 Mount Hood Jazz Festival. Thank you and enjoy.
Good afternoon, Oregonians, or good morning or evening, depending on where you are tuning in, and welcome to the 2021 virtual Mount Hood Jazz Festival. My name is Mika Brueggemann. We are in day 2 of 3, and I hope that you've been enjoying what you've seen and heard so far, and will continue to check out the great interactive webinars and performances to come. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsors, including AARP Oregon, Clackamas County Bank, the City of Gresham, Classic Pianos, Gresham Sanitary, the Gresham Center for the Arts Foundation, Austin Custom Brass, and Spinella's Restaurant. These sponsors, as well as several partners and supporters, have allowed us to bring this festival to you this weekend. You can visit our website for a complete list and to learn how you might also help support the festival so we can continue to elevate our jazz community both locally and beyond. The Mount Hood Jazz Festival would also like to honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. We thank PSU's Native Nations in collaboration with local tribal elders for the crafting of this statement. Today's presentation is a masterclass of 80 Years of Jazz in Portland by Lynn, Darroch, followed by a Q&A session. If you have any questions or comments throughout the presentation, make sure to throw them in your chat and I will relay those to Lynn. Author, journalist, and broadcaster Lynn Darroch will lead you through 80 years of jazz in Portland, focusing on its 3 golden ages in a video presentation with audio samples and photo illustrations to show how a mid-sized city with a small African-American population has supported a large and active jazz scene shaped by the environment, economic and social conditions, where craft is respected, history carried forward, young talent is nurtured, and nice guys often finish first. Much of the material is drawn from Darroch's 2016 book, Rhythm in the Rain, Jazz in the Pacific Northwest. If memory serves me correctly, the first time I met Lynn was on his KMHD show, Bright Moments, and it was when the Quadraphones were releasing our very first album back in 2010. And we were lucky enough to make it into his book, Rhythm in the Rain. And in preparation of this introduction, I pulled out my copy of the book and felt that there were 2 quotes that I thought best described Lynn's approach to the intertwining of life and music, and that also offered a moment of reflection during these uncertain times. The first is by journalist and jazz critic Doug Ramsey. Darroch has the curiosity of a journalist, the investigative skills of a historian, and the language of a poet. His writing about music makes you want to hear it. The second is by jazz pianist George Colligan. The thing I like most about Darroch's book is how evident it is that he knows how to roll with the punches of the jazz life. Jazz comes from blues, and blues came out of extreme hardship. Jazz musicians from whatever walk of life are no strangers to hardship. Sometimes you have a gig, and sometimes you don't. Oftentimes, you don't. Still, you never lose hope, and you just keep on playing no matter what. We play because we have to, not because we have gigs, or because we make money, or because people come to see us play. We play because we love it. Darroch's history lesson is honest, but he never loses his optimism. So without further ado, I'm very honored to present Lynn Darroch.
Hi, I'm Lynn Darroch, journalist, radio host, and author of the book Rhythm in the Rain, Jazz in the Pacific Northwest. And today I'll lead you on a journey through 80 years of jazz in Portland. You may have heard some of today's Portland artists, and if so, you're aware of what a rich and varied scene this relatively small city supports. So to set the stage for our historical trip, let's listen to a brief medley of currently active artists who represent different facets of the Portland scene, starting here with pianist, composer, and educator Darrell Grant. This is Rivers from his album The Territory. It aims to capture this geographical place in sound. Ruby Bridges Suite has been performed nationally. He's recently been working on a composition commissioned by Chamber Music America, and since arriving in Portland in 1996, he has furthered the cooperative and collaborative spirit of the city's jazz scene, as well as placing 2 albums on national jazz radio charts. And now you're listening to young guitarist and composer Chance Hayden with Squeeze Tight from his latest CD, Grab and Go. He's a Portland native whose work shows how the R&B that has been an important strand in the local jazz fabric since the 1950s is alive in contemporary form today. Next, pianist, composer, and educator George Colligan, who has played on more than 100 albums and attained a national reputation before he moved here in 2011. From his album with Jack DeJohnette and Larry Grenadier, The Endless Mysteries. Now you're listening to A Deepening Sense from trumpet player and composer Charlie Porter's album Immigration Nation. A classically trained performer with degrees from both the Juilliard and Manhattan schools of music, Porter toured Africa with the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra before moving to Portland, and he works locally with the Chuck Israels Jazz Orchestra as well as leading his own small groups. Now, to conclude our contemporary medley, it's B3 artist and composer Louis Payne. His work sits at the confluence of blues, jazz, and R&B. He spent 10 years with the Paul DeLay Band, and he's been with the Mel Brown B3 organ group since 1996. Here, he's leading his King Louis Blues Review with a host of R&B and blues stars, including vocalist Andy Stokes. So how did this varied scene develop? Well, let's return to those thrilling days of yesteryear, and I'll take you through the 3 golden ages of jazz in Portland. Peaks of activity that coincided with periods of full employment and were shaped by social conditions as well. It's a story I recount in detail in Rhythm in the Rain, but have condensed a great deal so we can get it all in today. Jazz in Portland grew up far from the centers of influence and power in a city with rough and tumble origins and a small African-American population that was shaped by the water and mountains that surround us. So a certain kind of artist has chosen to settle or remain here, often those who value the isolation and independence it offers, the do-it-yourself attitude it encourages, and our easy access to the natural world. Those conditions and the artists who have embraced them have created a jazz community where craft is respected and history honored, young talent nurtured, and nice guys often finish first. Of course, a number of artists who grew up in Portland left to become international stars, like Esperanza Spalding, but growing up here deeply influenced the musician she became. You're listening to her tribute to the city now.
From the city of roses, city of roses.
And many jazz immigrants to this city, including Warren Bracken, Spalding's mentor, Thera Memory, and Leroy Vinegar, brought influences and experiences from other regions with them, and that also influenced the Portland approach to jazz. But it's not big names that define jazz in Portland. Whether immigrant or native born, it's the values they share that have determined the character of this scene. You can't stay here if you're ever going to make it big, said trumpeter Floyd Standifer, who grew up in the only black family in 1930s Gresham and later worked with Quincy Jones. But if you're looking for some place where life can mean something, you come here. Before a local scene developed, touring musicians brought jazz to the city, including Jelly Roll Morton, who passed through town in the 1920s and stayed at the Golden West Hotel, the largest black-owned hotel west of the Mississippi at the time. But instead of listening to Morton himself, let's sample Portland native Andrew Oliver's recreation of Morton's Courthouse Bump to show that his music is still alive in the imagination of Portlanders today. Now, Portland and the entire Pacific Northwest was not a welcoming place for people of African heritage in those days, and that helps explain why Duke Ellington, who played Portland many times in the 1930s and 40s, traveled with his band in a private rail car, just like the president, he said. Other touring artists of color often stayed in the homes of Portland's black residents. Despite the barriers, they came because there was an audience for their music. There was a white jazz scene growing up in Portland in the 1930s, too, where pianist Gene Confer was developing an approach to chord voicings that would influence a generation that came after him, including pianist Lorraine Geller, who you're listening to here. Then came the building of Bonneville Dam in the 1930s and the shipyards that used its cheap electricity during World War II. And that changed everything, including the jazz scene, because jobs in the shipyards, as well as service in the armed forces, caused Portland's black population to expand almost overnight. As a result, in addition to discriminatory real estate and banking practices, along Williams Avenue, there grew up a nightclub scene that turned it into a 24/7 music village. And James Benton's converted garage in the Albina neighborhood was an important symbol of solidarity and a focus for that community during this first golden age. Sweet Baby James, as he was known, was a singer, and you're listening to him here with Louis Payne on organ. Louis and James worked together for many years.
Ain't been blue, baby.
The converted garage behind his house on Xavier near Williams was known as the backyard, and it held theater seats, a drum set, and 2 pianos. Outside there was a big barbecue and 3 mini golf holes. It was known all over, James remembered. Top musicians came, and wives, they'd be out back too. Some guys kind of lived out of there, and if a musician wasn't doing too good, just come by, man, get something to eat. As a teenager, Mel Brown frequented the backyard too. During the summer months, every day religiously, the musicians would congregate around 12 o'clock, barbecue like crazy, do some putting, and if you felt like playing, you went inside and played, Brown remembers. They would stay around till like 6 o'clock. Then everybody would go home, change, then go to their gigs. When the gigs were over, everybody went back and we'd jam until like 5 or 6 in the morning. It was really a musical family. For audiences, though, jazz was just part of a varied cultural experience in that active scene, and it often included gambling, after-hours liquor, and prostitution. It also became a crucible in which black and white musicians worked together, and in that crucible, many of the characteristics that have come to define jazz in Portland developed. You're listening now to a sample of that music from The Delegates with George Lawson. Much of that activity came to a halt in 1958, however, when the city razed part of the neighborhood to build the East Side Freeway and Memorial Coliseum. Suddenly, the nightclubs were gone. But the nearly all-white city of Portland had been irrevocably altered by a 5-fold increase in the African-American population whose cultural influence far exceeded its relatively small size. Other social conditions worked to erode Portland's first golden age too, including the city's crackdown on so-called vice, as well as the spread of TV and the baby boom. Both kept people at home, and rock and roll became the music of youth culture, replacing big band swing. In addition, after the mid-1960s, the practices that had blocked people of color from buying property were relaxed or ruled illegal, and the African-American middle class began to leave the Albina neighborhood. Black musicians were also able to work in what had previously been exclusively white territory, although that didn't come easy, as bandleader, pianist, and singer Warren Bracken found. Bracken came to Portland in 1950 after a stint as the house pianist at Billy Berg's in L.A. and tours with the Billy Eckstine Band, and he found, he said, a completely different life up here. And you're listening to his version of After Hours now. Bracken was one of the few African-American members of Musicians Local 99 and therefore able to work downtown, but he still met resistance. When I first joined the union, he recalled, they didn't want you to play downtown. They were saying, oh, you can't have that job, man. We've got white musicians out here walking the streets that need the work. But if you stood up and fought, Bracken learned, you got what you wanted. Bracken generously opened his bandstand to younger musicians, too, including drummer Ron Steen and Native American saxophonist Jim Pepper, both of whom became important influences. Pepper and Steen were just two of many players who emerged in the 1960s and early 70s, including Glenn Moore, David Friesen, Nancy King, and Tom Grant. And along with their contemporaries, they helped build an infrastructure that would support the jazz renaissance of the late 1970s. Some of those players left permanently, others returned, while newcomers began to arrive during the early 1970s too, including Janice Scroggins, Thera Memory, the Ghanaian master drummer Obo Adi, and pianist Eddie Weed. And here's Weed now on piano. Weed had learned his craft in the 1950s in what he called the University of Williams Avenue, and in an example of one way artists adapted to changing conditions in the 60s, Weed spent 15 years in Las Vegas and on tour with the pop jazz vocal group The Modern Airs. When he returned, his work as a teacher and mentor to younger players, in addition to regular nightclub performances, provided a crucial link between Portland's jazz past and the 21st century. And so did Portland's thriving blues scene. The blues had been an integral part of the Williams Avenue entertainment menu, and in the late 1960s and early 70s, Portland continued to be a blues stronghold, although the music was increasingly played by white musicians, especially the band leaders Lloyd Jones and Paul DeLay, and you're listening to the Paul DeLay Band now.
If I'd stayed there another minute, I'd go crazy without a doubt.
As the fusion of jazz and blues continued to evolve into funk, that sound also emerged on Portland stages with the Jeff Lorber Fusion, a group that included Seattle saxophonist Kenny G. Here's a sample of Lorber's music. So it may seem that the 1960s and early 70s were a kind of dark ages for jazz, but a lot of activity was still going on, and it shaped what was to come when that period ended, symbolically anyway, with the return of Mel Brown. The construction that had taken out the heart of the Williams Avenue scene was followed in 1970 by the destruction of nearly 300 homes and businesses in North Portland when the city and expansion minded Legacy Emmanuel Hospital. raised the residential center of the city's African American community. So it's fitting that Mel Brown, who had cut his teeth on Williams and grew up in the neighborhood that was destroyed in 1970, should be a factor in setting the jazz scene on the road back to popularity when he returned in 1973. You're listening to the Mel Brown Trio now. For more than a decade, Brown had toured with the Temptations, the Four Tops, Martha and the Vandellas, and Diana Ross. He'd recorded with George Harrison and played in the house band at the Apollo Theater, and faced with the lack of jazz action he found on his return, he was about to leave town again when his mother said, "Don't run from the problem, do something about it." So he decided to bring a trio into Fracasso's Prima Donna downtown, and after a couple of nights, there was a line out front. The jazz renaissance that would hit its peak by the late 1970s was underway. Brown was always striving for excellence, and during the 1980s, he put together a sextet modeled on Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers that honed its repertoire and approach at a Southeast Portland club called The Hobbit. They produced the critically acclaimed CD, The Mel Brown Sextet Plays the Music of Gordon Lee, and you're listening to that album now. And they won a nationwide competition that landed them a slot at the Playboy Jazz Festival. Pianist and composer Lee had arrived in Portland in 1977, one of the many jazz immigrants who contributed to the second Golden Age. Now, I call Mr. Brown the golden thread that pulls all the strands of jazz in Portland together. He lived the whole story, from the first Golden Age on Williams through the second into the third and beyond. He embodies the city's history and carries it forward with him today, and he's passed it along through his exemplary musicianship and teaching. Brown was not alone in his pursuit of excellence, of course, and the high-level artistry of such musicians as Nancy King, Glenn Moore, David Friesen, Ron Steen, and Tom Grant all contributed to the dedication to craftsmanship that also became a characteristic of jazz in Portland. So let's listen for a moment to Nancy King and Glenn Moore. And by the way, Brown's first paying job with the Marianne Mayfield Trio when he was just a teenager also allowed him to learn from Julian Henson, one of the region's top black pianists since the 1930s. After his stint in the Motown stable, Brown continued occasional touring in the 1980s with Diana Ross, and he took along with him two young Portland area natives, bassist Phil Baker, who's currently with Pink Martini, and pianist George Mitchell, who continues as Ross's pianist today. But Brown's focus was in Portland. His return to Portland also coincided with the beginning of college jazz studies programs, which attracted a number of important players, including Steve Christofferson, who you're listening to now. Other arrivals included Mike Horsfall, Mark Simon, and Ben Wolfe, who left town for New York to work with Harry Connick Jr. and Wynton Marsalis. Vancouver native Gary Hobbs also attended college here before joining the Stan Kenton Band for several years, and then he too returned home. Those jazz programs have grown, and most jazz artists in Portland today have college degrees, but it was the bandstand experience with veterans that really made the players in the second Golden Age the artists they became. This town has such a wonderful tradition and such great players, observed bassist Phil Baker. He's pictured here with Eddie Harris. The education I got at Delavans and some of those clubs you couldn't buy at Juilliard. Not just the luminaries like Sonny Stitt and Joe Henderson, but the local greats like Warren Bracken and Eddie Weed, who just had this grace you had to experience to assimilate. Jazz has to be handed down that way. Now, you're listening now to several of the key Portland players from the 1980s with the legendary Eddie Harris, and this was recorded in Wilsonville. The result of all the activity those players generated was Portland's second golden age. By 1981, Portland had more live jazz than any other West Coast city. 48 eating and drinking establishments were presenting jazz in some form or other, from solo piano to big bands, and boosters were calling Portland Kansas City on the Willamette. Straight-ahead and avant-garde styles, funk and blues, could all find audiences interested in what they were doing. Indeed, many clubs presented multiple styles at this time, echoing the kind of mix that was heard on Williams Avenue in the 1950s. Now here's avant-garde saxophonist Rich Hawley, whose albums often have environmental references. And again, the local economy was important, despite the recession that hit Oregon in the early 1980s. At that time, as guitarist Dan Ballmer observed, Portland was a place where even jazz musicians could afford to buy a house. The availability of affordable housing was important to the growth of the jazz scene since, as many have observed, it's one of the key factors that determine where arts activity is most prolific. The Jazz Society of Oregon also played a role. Founded in 1973 by fans who wanted more jazz in the city, it helped promote the music by presenting concerts and publishing a newsletter with a monthly jazz calendar. That DIY spirit has since been a characteristic of Portland's jazz support system. And that DIY spirit was also responsible for the birth of the Cathedral Park Jazz Festival. It was founded and continues to depend today on the small is beautiful ethic. From the beginning, it presented local artists in a few national acts. It also had a neighborhood origin since it was created as a tribute to Howard Galbraith, known as the mayor of St. John's. He spearheaded a volunteer effort to clean up the wasteland under the St. John's Bridge and turn it into the public park where the festival takes place, and it remains admission-free and largely run by volunteers today. A year later, in 1982, the Mount Hood Festival of Jazz debuted in the football stadium at Mount Hood Community College, and at its peak, in a 3-stage, multi-day format with many internationally known performers, the festival brought tens of thousands out for jazz, as well as the beach blanket party atmosphere that accompanied the music. You're looking at a photo of that crowd and listening to Sonny Rollins, just one of the many stars who put on memorable performances there. The festival ended in bankruptcy in 2002, but returned in a reduced form and continues today. About the same time, the Zoo, Your Zoo, and All That Jazz concert series at the Oregon Zoo started. It began primarily as a jazz series with many Portland artists and was free with zoo admission, but as the years passed, it began to book national acts and many non-jazz performers and became the ticketed event it is today. Jazz at various Willamette Valley wineries followed, expanding the outdoor, party-like jazz experience. The Waterfront Blues Festival also began small in 1987, but it's grown to a huge 5-day event. Now, all those events echo the Williams Avenue scene where jazz was part of a larger cultural experience for many listeners. They also helped expand the audience for jazz and boosted the amount of work available for musicians, just a couple of the factors that would soon make the city a magnet for another wave of jazz immigrants, including Leroy Vinegar, who's pictured here. Those events went hand in hand with the economic and population growth that Portland was experiencing too, a development that led to gentrification. It included the explosion of Oregon's Silicon Forest, as well as the construction of Pioneer Square and the Max Light Rail line and Waterfront Park. Downtown office towers also changed the skyline, and the U.S. Bancorp Tower's 37th floor restaurant featured a jazz trio led by Mel Brown and Leroy Vinegar. Its association with those developments helped make jazz appear to be, in the minds of many anyway, the music of urban sophistication. You could also see that trend in the Tom Grant Band, a pop jazz ensemble that took off from Grant's pioneering smooth jazz albums of the mid-1980s and early 90s that kept him on the charts for a decade. And you're listening to a sample of Grant's music at that time here. Born in 1946, Grant also represents a thread running through the history of jazz in Portland. His father owned a Williams Avenue record store, and his primary teacher was Gene Confer. But Tom Grant also spent 5 years, along with David Friesen and Ron Steen, touring with Joe Henderson and Woody Shaw, then 3 years with former Miles Davis drummer Tony Williams. He also worked for Charles Lloyd. After those experiences and his decade of smooth jazz success, however, Grant returned to his hometown roots in straight-ahead jazz. And you're listening to an example of that music here with bassist Baker and drummer Steen, whose photo from the 1980s appears now. A key member of Grant's band during the late 80s and early 90s was guitarist Dan Ballmer, another Portland native who toured internationally with vocalist Diane Shure. Like Grant, he also abandoned the road for a career in Portland. "I guess I'm just a hometown boy," Tom Grant explained, and many other Portland natives have felt the same. The second golden age began to fade by the mid-1980s, when the number of eating and drinking establishments presenting live jazz was half what had been a few years earlier. But the number of jazz musicians in the city continued to grow, and the top players continued to work regularly, so Portland still supported a vital, though reduced, scene. Well, let's listen to a quick sample of Dan Ballmer's music now. All right, so into that environment came the jazz giants whose active involvement in the community would help kindle the third golden age of the late 1990s and early 2000s. In many cases, those jazz immigrants came to Portland for the lifestyle, but they ended up staying for and changing the music. Here, they could take their kids to the mountains and afford to live on leafy streets. Drummer Dick Burke, who played with Billie Holiday and many other jazz legends, came from Las Vegas. Singer-songwriter and pianist Dave Frischberg also arrived in 1986, as did legendary bassist Vinegar. You're listening to Frischberg now, and he's pictured here.
I want to be a sideman, just an ordinary sideman. I go along for the ride, man.
Bassist Red Mitchell settled in Salem, pianist Jessica Williams lived in Portland for several years, and saxophonist Hadley Calaman took up residence in the little Columbia River town of Cathlamet. Thelonious Monk's saxophonist Charlie Rouse moved to the area in the 1980s too. And Portland welcomed their involvement. For example, Vinegar led a band at the Jazz de Opus that drew enthusiastic crowds of 30-something listeners. and Dave Frischberg realized the dream he'd expressed in his song, I Want to Be a Sideman, as well as serving as an accompanist for Portland vocalist Rebecca Kilgore. Drummer Alan Jones, who has since become an influential band leader and teacher, learned a great deal from Vinegar, and then he gave it his own individualistic Portland twist on his sextet's album Unsafe, as you might guess from the photo of that group here. Many other Portland musicians profited from those associations with older immigrants who offered them another connection to the music's storied past. And speaking of the music's past, Ghanaian master drummer Obo Adi, who came to Portland in 1979, had a big impact too. Many Portland jazz players passed through his Afro-pop fusion band, and he also taught the principles of West African drumming to others, helping link jazz in Portland to world music. So, while the amount of nightclub work available to jazz artists declined in the late 1980s, ancillary jobs began to open up, especially in college jazz programs. So, Portland did provide a refuge of sorts where it was possible to practice your art in the company of high-level players and cobble together a living in music. By the time the economic boom of the 1990s was underway, the quality and quantity of resident jazz was ready for its third golden age. Pianist, composer, and educator Darrell Grant may best represent Portland's third golden age. A Denver, Colorado native, he played in bands led by Roy Haynes and Betty Carter before his 1994 record, Black Art, made the New York Times list of that year's top 10 jazz recordings, but making it in New York wasn't enough. I didn't feel my music was having the kind of impact I wanted, he explained. I was looking for a sense of community, a place where I could make a contribution and serve. Grant found that place when he took a position at Portland State University in 1996. But he managed to have it both ways. While he established a vital place for himself on the local scene, he released 2 albums that reached jazz radio's top 10 charts. And you're listening to one of them now, Smokin' Java, which is accompanied by liner notes that tell the story of a jazz musician who found a home in a city full of coffee houses. The local press was also routinely reporting on local jazz activity as well as touring stars. The festivals received extensive coverage. There was a large group of highly skilled artists, and there was an audience willing to support them. The Jazz Society of Oregon, for example, had nearly 1,000 members in 1999. There was jazz on the radio, jazz education programs in public schools, and room for the avant-garde as well as straight-ahead and other styles. In 1998, then Mayor Vera Katz issued a proclamation declaring Portland Jazz Capital of the West Coast. Again, all that jazz activity went hand in hand with the general economic prosperity of the decade. In 6 years, for instance, the median household income in the country had risen nearly $10,000, and a new jazz club, Jimmy Mac's, reflected those trends. Like the rapidly gentrifying Northwest Portland neighborhood where it was located, Jimmy Mac's started out in 1996 old school and rode the city's deep support for straight-ahead jazz as well as the funk revival, which was led by the Mel Brown B3 organ group, who you're listening to now. And then Jimmy Mac's moved into a new building in 2006 that seated more than 100 and offered fine dining as well as nightly jazz, a physical symbol of the changes that had ushered in the third golden age. So despite the fact that the life of a jazz musician was as precarious as always, pay for nightclub work had not gone up for a decade, for instance, while the cost of living was rising. Portland was still an attractive place to play jazz and pursue a lifestyle that emphasized personal and artistic goals over financial success. In 2002, a Downbeat magazine article proclaimed Portland the new jazz mecca. So more musicians continued to come and collaborate, and as a result, the Portland sound evolved again. But as the music changed, the core values that had always defined the scene remained. Nice guys often finished first. Promising young players were nurtured, jam sessions flourished, and older musicians were still available to pass along their knowledge, like James Benton did for Esperanza Spalding, pictured together here. So the third golden age endured on the strength of those trends until the global financial crisis of 2008. In the years leading up to that moment, grassroots jazz activity, including house concerts, also helped keep musicians active and audiences engaged. You're listening now to one musician who took advantage of those small venues, guitarist John Stoller. Those musicians contributed to and reflected Portland's reputation for creative culture and a craft ethic based on locally brewed beer, coffee roasting, trend-setting restaurants, graphic novels, and even a small film industry. But the biggest boost to public awareness of the city's jazz culture during its third golden age came from the Portland Jazz Festival. A multi-day midwinter event, the festival was staged downtown and was financed by partnerships with the Visitors Association, airlines, and hotels. By 2007, it was named one of the country's top festivals, due in part to the marketing strategy of its founder, Bill Royston, as well as bold programming. It also included many admission-free shows by local artists, but the headline events were high-ticket affairs that reflected the increasing gentrification of jazz. In another example, the Vancouver, Washington Wine and Jazz Festival debuted in 1998 and over the years increased its non-jazz acts and emphasis on wine, craft booths, and food. One of its crowds is pictured here. Successful festivals of this kind present jazz in places where people with disposable income want to be, like Vancouver's beautiful Esther Short Park, and pair it with activities that appeal to the same demographic. Interestingly enough, that was the same formula that made the Williams Avenue scene so popular in the city's first golden age, with a different demographic and different activities, of course. By 2011, however, the scene looked bleak to many musicians who had experienced that third golden age. The audience was shrinking, as was club work, and the local economy was tanking. And yet more high-level jazz players continued to arrive, including George Colligan, Devin Phillips, Todd Strait, Eddie Martinez, and Chuck Israels, pictured here with his 10-piece orchestra. In fact, when he arrived, Colligan thought Portland could become a viable alternative to New York City. But his optimism faded after half a dozen more key venues closed in 2014. Even as the audience seemed to be getting thin, the city was bursting with exciting jazz projects and musical excellence. Just one example was the emergence of the Christopher Brown Quartet, led by drummer and composer Christopher, son of Mel Brown, and young bassist Damian Erskine also became a presence on the scene when he wasn't touring and recording elsewhere. This audio sample is from Erskine's album, So to Speak. But then the internet changed everything, and the album sales that had formed an important income stream for many artists dried up. And yet for some, the new reality was liberating. There's no money in it anymore, observed Darroch Grant, and that's created a lot of freedom. The illusion of success has been taken away, so we might as well do what we want. Many musicians adapted to the new economic reality by diversifying, selling instruction booklets and merchandise online, teaching and using social media to stay in touch with and create a larger audience base, or by getting day jobs. They've also played in a variety of styles in recording sessions and on stage, and some are even calling their music post-jazz, as do Bear Brown and the Blue Cranes, pictured here, whose 2010 album Observatories you're listening to now. And established festivals continued to grow. Plus a new one appeared, the Montevilla Jazz Festival, another small is beautiful, neighborhood-based annual event. The Portland Jazz Composers Ensemble, founded in 2011, also emerged, and it generated several big projects and opportunities for musicians. And the artists continued to arrive in Portland. Why? Well, an economics professor has created a metric he calls the sacrifice measure that charts how poor a person is willing to be in order to live in a particular city. Portland was near the top of the list. Ultimately, the direction jazz takes will be determined by its audience as much as by the musicians. And audience behavior is powerfully affected by social and economic conditions. In order to thrive, jazz must do what it always has, reflect the circumstances of those who live in this singular place. And who can be sure what our lives will be like a year from now? I think history shows, however, that jazz will continue to be part of the city's cultural fabric and will continue to evolve with it.
Hello, everybody, and that was Lynn Darroch's take on the past 80 years of jazz in Portland. Lynn, thank you so much for putting that all together. When did you put that whole video series together?
Well, most recently, just last about 2
During
weeks
COVID
ago,
times?
I just finished 2 weeks ago. Yes.
Is this how we spend a productive COVID time? Is
Well,
by
I
putting
wish I
this
had had
together?
that much time, but I don't think I had but a month to do it,
Oh
actually.
my.
Well,
Well,
fortunately, I was able to draw a lot from my book, Rhythm in the Rain, Jazz in the Pacific Northwest. But the hardest thing, of course, was to condense all of the 80 years of history down into 44 minutes of video.
yeah, that's a whole lot of history to have to squish into a very short video. But
Yes, I was very sorry to have to leave out so many important people and places and events.
you'll have to do a supplementary video, perhaps, that could
Yeah.
be tagged along
Yeah.
with that one. So we do have a comment from Sharon Mary Treadgold, who says that, Lynn, you signed Sharon's book of Rhythm in the Rain years ago, and how that video was just a perfect companion piece for that.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thanks,
yes,
Sharon.
yeah.
I remember, I think she was named KMHD #1 jazz fan at some like the 2016 Portland Jazz Festival or something.
Hey, that's
So
fantastic. I love that.
congratulations again, Sharon.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And then we have a question right out of the bat here from Dunya. So Dunya is asking, what happened to the proclamation of being the jazz capital of the West Coast? Is it still active?
Well, whatever happens to those proclamations, some of them last. For example, the Oregon legislature named, I can't remember the date, but they named one day in the springtime, could be even today, or May the 5th, anyway, as Leroy Vinegar Day. And I believe that is still an actively celebrated thing. Darrell Grant created at Portland State University the Leroy Vinegar Jazz Institute. And so some of these kinds of things remain, and others of them just vanish into the ether, having only a moment's impact.
Lynn, I have a very funny story for you and our viewers, if you'll indulge me for 1 minute.
Please, stories we love.
My husband was convinced by one of his best friends to move to Portland, Oregon. I believe he was in Omaha at the time, but although he did a lot of traveling, so I'm not sure. But when he moved up here, and this friend years later, ended up marrying us. So he's a dear friend of both of ours. And I guess when he first moved to Portland, he came across a bass player playing on the street, as the story goes, as I understand it. And the bass player handed him this box, and it says, "The best to you, enjoy the Walker, Leroy Vinegar, 1994." And inside the box is a watch.
Wow.
With Leroy Vinegar on it.
Does it tell time?
If the battery were still working, it probably would. I was actually interested in trying to get another battery for this to see if it did work. But this was kind of a really precious little gem that our friend sort of bequeathed to us as.
Wow, what a beautiful thing that was. Leroy playing on the street.
Yeah, at least that's my understanding of it. I need to actually, it's been a while since that story has been told. So
that's the way history is, isn't it?
Exactly.
It does change and move around a little bit. I know that one of the first gigs Leroy had in Portland was at this restaurant called La Carreta on McLaughlin Boulevard. And I think he just walked in there and tried to get a gig because it was nearby to where he lived at the time. He came here because his heart surgeon was here, and he thought that he would have a quiet life in Portland and work on his memoirs. And instead, of course, he became a very active part of the jazz scene.
Yeah, that's so fantastic. Well, and that sort of seems, that's very common thing. Some people, just musicians, maybe come up here to check something out, and then they completely sort of get steeped into the music scene, which is kind of a beautiful thing about playing jazz here in the Pacific Northwest. So that's lovely. Lynn, are you a musician? Do you play instruments?
I'm an amateur, and I don't hardly play much anymore because my hands are all gnarled up. But
and what
yes, I started in my young life as a musician. Yeah.
What did you play?
Well, woodwinds. What else, Mika?
Fair enough. And so was that sort of the seed that started your interest in jazz in the Northwest and developing this book, Rhythm in the Rain?
Well, no, I'd have to say that I somehow along the line, I decided there were better things to do than singing for your supper. And so I became a literature and a writing instructor, and was chasing the great American novel instead of the great American composition. And I only got back into paying attention to music in the 1970s when I got some opportunities to write about it, and decided that sort of fell into it, actually, as I've often fallen into all the things I do in life. And when things appear before me, I just take the opportunity that's given. And so I believe Rick Mitchell, who's living back in Portland nowadays, was editing a publication called The Jazz Scene, and he gave me an opportunity to write for that. And I think that started it all. And then I moved over to Willamette Week and the Oregonian and began to write for national and newspapers and magazines. And so all those things piled up. And then the Ooligan Press at Portland State University approached me in 2014 and asked me to do the book called Rhythm in the Rain.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And all along your research, because you gathered a lot of these stories orally from the actual musicians.
Yes, actually, everything I know about music, I've learned from the musicians themselves.
And so was there anything, and especially as you're looking at all the years that have passed by, one thing that really stuck out from the documentary was the fact when you mentioned that Ron Steen was in Brecken's band, which...
No, not in Warren
right?
Bracken's band, no.
Oh. Which...
I believe Warren Bracken allowed a lot of the younger players to come and sit in with him, and sometimes were on a paid basis when
Gotcha.
Warren was playing downtown in the
Gotcha.
1960s and 70s.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And those included Jim Pepper and Ron Steen.
Right. Yes, that was the reference. So it just, in my mind, in some ways that seems so long ago, but, it's really not. It's just in a blink of an eye that all of this has happened. So in thinking of, putting all of these stories together, was there anything that stuck out to you as being really surprising or shocking or unexpected?
Well, I guess every twist and turn is unexpected at the time that it occurs. And when we look back, everything seems to logical and to make sense, or at least that's the storyteller's job, isn't it? To make everything seem inevitable and a part of a logical progression. But I would say that, some of the big changes, like the huge increase in the population of people of African heritage in Portland was a surprising development because, Oregon started out with such a racist history.
Yeah.
But they were brought here by economic opportunity primarily, and that changed everything, really, and for the better, I would say.
I was just going to say that too.
I think we have to really look to our Black population and give a lot of appreciation for the large cultural contribution that they have made, not only in jazz music, of course. Bobby Smith, with his, I forget the name of the project that he has to document all of the funk music that has come out of Albina in the 60s through the 80s. I believe that is really documenting a large part of the contribution of the African-American population to Portland's cultural history as well. So that was kind of a surprising twist in the history of Portland. And then I would say that the arrival of so many, well, I've called them jazz immigrants to the area, that really had a big impact as well. And there was no predicting such a thing. It just happened because, again, of the economy elsewhere. People got tired of living in crummy apartments in New York, and or they had other opportunities here. George Colligan got his teaching job, and Darroch got his teaching job, and so that brought people here. I remember David Valdez, who has moved elsewhere now, came here as a visitor in 2002, and he saw so much activity, he decided to move here from California, where he was based at that time.
Yeah.
So Jasnam Dea Singh moved here. He was known as Weber Iago in those days, from Central California as well. All those people have had a big impact on the people they play with. And I think in music, it's the company you keep that really has the biggest impact on the kind of music you make.
Yes.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. I was always sort of intimidated in the New York scene, or even the LA West Coast scene, because it was just so highly competitive, and I didn't ever want music to be that way. Not that I'm not competitive necessarily, but that just wasn't where I wanted to be musically. And I am so grateful for the musicians and the bands that I play with now, because it is such a nurturing community, and I feel like I've really grown because of these various influences that have affected me over the years. So yeah, I'm very grateful for that. Let's see here. We do have some questions. Another question from Sharon. She was curious to know if there were any updates that you may know of about Jimmy Max. Jimmy Max, for some of our viewers who may not be aware, although it was on the documentary, was one of the premier jazz venues here in Portland, but that got shut down, unfortunately, due to Jimmy's passing away. And also, Sharon she says, also think it was so cool about the Castle Jazz Club near Gladstone area. And she's wondering if any artifacts are remaining from there.
I don't know about artifacts, but I was thinking about one of the groups that I have left out mentioning in this video was the Castle Jazz Band, which had a big following in the Portland area in the 50s and 60s. No, I don't know anything about that. I haven't really been a collector of things. Just tried to collect information, really, and so I don't have any posters and very few audio artifacts from the early days. Unfortunately, there are people out there who probably have collected those things, but it hasn't been me. She wanted to know about updates on Jimmy Max and John David Studenberg, who was the bar manager at Jimmy Max during its heyday. In fact, all the time, I think, that it existed. Yeah. He and his partner, whose name slips my mind right now, have been working to try to revive the club. And so if you get on Facebook and become a friend of John David Studenberg, you may get some updates from him. I myself don't have any.
All right, that's good to know. And I'm going to give just a couple minutes for anybody to ask any further questions that they may have for Lynn or about the presentation. And in the meantime, I just wanted to remind all of you that this year's festival is happening because of sponsors and supporters who value the arts and want to ensure that our musicians weather the pandemic. We are grateful for their contributions because it has allowed us to bring these events to you for free. If you would like to make a donation to the festival so that we might continue to be able to provide work for musicians and education and inspiration for you, the link is below and in the chat. And I think I sent the link at the very beginning of the chat there. If you'd like a free way to help the festival, hit the share button and tell your friends. Please make sure you like and subscribe to our media channels and click the notification bell so you get notified when we go live or post a video. And let me see if there are any other questions. Lynn, do you have anything else that you'd
Well,
like to add?
I just wanted to name some of the names that I have left out, because I think there's so many important people like Walter Bridges, who led a big band here for many years, starting in the 1940s. And he might have been the first African-American person to be a member of Musicians Local 99 here in Portland. Akbar DePriest was another one who put on a lot of concerts and brought a lot of younger musicians along in the 70s and 80s. And I also, you saw a photograph of a young, very young Esperanza Spalding playing bass with the Sweet Baby James Benton. And right next to her was Bobby Bradford, the trumpet player. And he and Cleve Williams were also very important in the 1940s and 50s in Portland. And moving into the 1990s and 2000s, of course, Randy Porter, the pianist and composer and teacher, has been a really crucial person. And he was named most recently the Jazz Journalists Association's Jazz Hero for 2021 in Portland. The Jazz Journalists Association Jazz Hero for 2020 in Portland was Ron Steen. And so you see there's a very good lineage that Randy belongs to there. So I want to thank the festival for letting me spout off on all this history, and all those of you who tuned in and watched it. And of course, this video will be available to watch later if you came late and would like to see the whole thing. And so thanks very much to Dan Davey, the festival director at Mount Hood Community College, and to the festival, and to Mika Brueggemann, my friend Mika, who does so much good education work and plays a mean baritone saxophone. Thank you all.
And Lynn, I do have actually one last question for you, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
Do you have any predictions, especially post-COVID world, about a fourth golden age for Portland, Oregon?
I don't know. I wish I could. I've never been very good at predicting the future, and I'm not sure anyone can, but I think that there's probably a lot of pent-up need for music. There's a lot of need for music, and I think people need to love to experience music live, and when they feel it's safe to do so, I think that you will see a large increase in the number of people who are out attending those events. Right now, it's a rather stop and start and a spotty beginning to all that. And I think it will probably pick up in the summer as there are outdoor events. But as you know, as a musician, there aren't a lot of gigs happening even in the summertime. And so we'll have to wait and see what direction things go. As I mentioned in the video, so much of musical activity depends on the economics of the current situation, and we'll just have to see what happens there, and whether these golden ages have corresponded with eras of full employment, so-called full employment. And I think that perhaps as we see the economy rebound, we will see jazz activity follow suit.
I'm going to keep my fingers crossed for all
I
of those
bet, yeah,
things.
musicians
Yes.
most importantly.
For sure. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for all of your research and for keeping all of these really critical jazz voices alive, and for sharing this wonderful video. Make sure to stick around for more of our programming. We have the U.S. Army Band tonight at 6 o'clock. And you may even catch Portland trombonist Javier Nero playing with them. And so enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you to Mount Hood Community College. Thank you, Dan Davey. Thank you, Left Door Streaming. And thank you to my Portland and Pacific Northwest community of musicians.